The night she was refused unfolded beneath crystal chandeliers, where light fractured itself into 1,000 watching eyes and every whisper found a place to land. Music breathed through the ballroom, violins trembling like held sighs, yet around her there existed a pocket of silence so complete it felt deliberate. Miss Eliza Harrow stood near the edge of the floor, gloved hands folded with careful restraint, her posture faultless, her heart bruised and bare beneath satin. She had learned long ago how to remain composed while being quietly undone. They spoke her name as though it were a cautionary tale. Not loudly. Never cruelly enough to invite rebuke. Just softly enough that it might be denied if challenged. A failed engagement, an unfortunate association, a woman of accomplishments but uncertain fortune. In rooms like these, uncertainty was the gravest sin. Eliza felt it settle upon her shoulders like ash, the residue of judgments she could neither brush away nor deserve. It was then that the Duke of Ravensmere approached. His presence announced not by sound but by the subtle recalibration of attention. Men straightened. Women paused. He moved with the economy of one long accustomed to command, tall and grave, his dark attire severe against the glittering excess of the room. His expression bore the stillness of stone warmed only by duty. To look upon him was to understand that some griefs were worn inward, polished smooth by years of silence. He bowed, precise and distant, and spoke her name without warmth or disdain. That alone unsettled her more than cruelty might have done. Their conversation was brief, courteous, and devastating in its restraint. He addressed the rumors obliquely, as society required, yet his meaning was unmistakable. He could offer her employment, respectability within limits, shelter beneath his roof. What he could not offer, he said, was affection. Love, he concluded softly, as though closing a ledger, is an indulgence I have buried with my past. I will not resurrect it, nor pretend otherwise. The words did not strike like a blow. They settled, heavy and final, upon the space between them. Eliza inclined her head, the gesture of a woman practiced in accepting less than she deserved. She did not ask for his reasons. She did not plead. To do so would have been undignified, and dignity was the last possession she refused to surrender. As he withdrew, the ballroom seemed to exhale. Conversation resumed, richer for the quiet drama it had consumed. Eliza remained still, acutely aware of how alone one could feel in a room filled with hundreds. She sensed, rather than saw, the gaze of two small figures observing from the staircase above. The Duke's children, recently returned from the country, watched her with an intensity unsoftened by manners. Their eyes held curiosity, not judgment, and something like hope. Later, beneath a sky bruised purple by evening, Eliza stepped into the carriage that would carry her from the warmth of borrowed society into the unknown of necessity. The Duke's estate lay hours away, ancient and remote, its halls governed by rules older than affection. She told herself she had chosen this path. Choice, however, felt fragile when made in the absence of alternatives. Rain began to fall as the carriage wheels turned, blurring the city into streaks of memory and regret. Eliza pressed her gloved hand to the glass, steadying herself against the lurching road and the sharper ache beneath her ribs. She would be governess, companion, invisible witness to a life sealed against tenderness. She would ask for nothing beyond her duty. The carriage lantern swayed, casting brief halos across her reflection, and in that shifting light Eliza examined the woman she had become. Not ruined, though society flirted with the word. Not naive, though she still believed kindness could be courage. She recalled the Duke's profile as he turned away, the rigid line of his jaw, the manner in which sorrow had disciplined his features into something formidable. The estate gates emerged at last, iron ribs rising from the mist like a warning rather than a welcome. Ravensmere House loomed beyond, vast and shadowed, its windows dark save for a single lamp burning high above the ground. Servants appeared with efficient silence, their faces schooled into neutrality. Eliza stepped down, the gravel crunching beneath her boots, and felt the weight of expectation settle anew. Inside, the air smelled of polish, old books, and extinguished fires. Portraits watched from the walls, generations of faces united by severity and distance. Somewhere deeper within the house, a door creaked, followed by the quick retreat of footsteps too light to belong to an adult. She paused, listening, aware that she had been noticed again. A maid led her to a modest chamber overlooking the east gardens. On the bed lay her single trunk, neatly placed, and beside it a folded note bearing the Duke's seal. She broke it open, read its careful welcome, and understood the truth of her position. She had entered a house that had renounced love, yet not, it seemed, the quiet yearning for it. Outside, the rain ceased, leaving the world hushed and expectant, as though something within those walls had already begun to stir. She sat upon the edge of the bed, the silence pressing close, and felt the day's humiliation settle into resolve. Whatever shame society had placed upon her, she would not carry it into tomorrow. Beyond the corridor, the house breathed, old timbers murmuring with secrets. A faint laugh, quickly stifled, drifted from below, unmistakably youthful. Eliza's lips curved despite herself. Somewhere in Ravensmere, two children remained awake, curious about the woman their father had declared incapable of being loved. She did not yet know why, but the certainty lingered that before dawn, Ravensmere would answer her presence, and the Duke's careful vows would begin, quietly, to unravel slowly. Morning arrived at Ravensmere with a pale, deliberate grace, as though the sun itself hesitated to intrude upon a house long accustomed to restraint. Eliza rose early, attuned to the rhythms of service, and dressed in subdued colors that neither invited notice nor invited dismissal. From her window the gardens unfurled in ordered patience, dew clinging to roses like secrets unwilling to be told. She breathed in the quiet and prepared herself to be useful. The children came to her first, not by command but by instinct. Henry, solemn beyond his years, carried a book too large for his arms, while Clara hovered at the threshold, curiosity brightening her caution. Eliza greeted them as equals, not subjects, and something subtle shifted in the room. Lessons unfolded without severity. She listened as much as she instructed, and the children responded with an eagerness that surprised even themselves. Laughter, restrained yet genuine, found its way between conjugations and sums. The Duke observed from a distance. He passed through corridors without announcing himself, pausing where shadows softened the lines of his authority. He noted the children's unguarded attention, the way they leaned toward Eliza as flowers incline toward light. It unsettled him. Order had been restored after loss by careful boundaries, and here was a woman who crossed them without intention. He told himself it was temporary, a novelty soon dulled by routine. Yet tokens began to appear. A volume of poetry lay upon Eliza's desk one evening, its margins worn with use, no inscription to explain its presence. Another day, she found a shawl placed over the back of her chair when the draught from the windows sharpened. These gestures were anonymous, restrained, almost accidental, and thus impossible to refuse. Gratitude rose in her, tempered by caution. She understood the language of restraint well enough to know its dangers. Whispers followed gratitude. A visiting cousin remarked upon Eliza's influence with a smile too sharp to be kind. Servants exchanged glances that lingered longer than propriety allowed. The house had noticed the softening at its center, and like all such places, it sought to correct the imbalance. Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the warning that acceptance was conditional and easily revoked. The incident occurred on an afternoon weighted with rain. Clara had slipped on the stone steps near the orangery, her cry cutting through the hush like a blade. Eliza ran without thought, skirts soaked as she gathered the trembling child into her arms. The Duke arrived moments later, breathless, his composure fractured by fear. He took Clara from Eliza with hands that shook despite himself, and for an instant their gazes locked, raw and unguarded. That instant was witnessed. A footman paused beneath the archway. A guest turned away too quickly. By evening, the narrative had been assembled and passed along with the certainty of invention. Eliza was summoned to the drawing-room, where the Duke stood rigid by the hearth, firelight carving his profile into something severe. He spoke of appearances, of propriety, of the necessity of distance. His voice was controlled, but beneath it lay a current of alarm that betrayed more than he intended. Eliza listened, her dignity intact but strained. She assured him she had never sought to exceed her place, that her concern for his daughter was instinctive, not strategic. The words tasted of old defenses. He inclined his head, accepting her explanation while retreating behind formality. The shawl disappeared. The poetry book was removed. Order reasserted itself with ruthless efficiency. Days passed colder. Lessons continued, but laughter dimmed. Henry watched his father with new wariness. Clara clung to Eliza with a desperation that spoke of fear she could not name. Eliza bore it quietly, reminding herself that this was the natural correction of hope. She had misread kindness for invitation, and society had been swift to remind her of the difference. Still, in the evenings, when the house settled and the lamps burned low, she sensed a tension lingering just beyond sight, as though restraint itself were listening, waiting to be challenged or confirmed. On the third night after the incident, Eliza encountered the Duke on the staircase, their paths crossing by chance alone. Neither spoke. The space between them filled with everything unsaid, apology withheld, gratitude unexpressed, fear carefully masked as indifference. He stepped aside to allow her passage, his hand brushing the banister rather than her sleeve, and she understood that the distance he enforced cost him more than he would ever admit, and that silence was his chosen penance. One evening, summoned unexpectedly, she entered the library to find the Duke alone, a letter crushed in his hand. He spoke without preamble, informing her that arrangements were being reconsidered. The words fell like stones, heavy and irrevocable. Eliza felt the old humiliation stir, yet beneath it rose something steadier, a resolve tempered by affection she had not planned to feel. She bowed, accepting what had not yet been fully said. As she turned to leave, a folded paper slipped from the Duke's desk, unnoticed by him but not by her. It bore the uneven script of a child. Eliza did not pick it up. She did not need to. The knowledge that something had been written, chosen, and hidden was enough to still her steps, to anchor her breathing, to convince her that the household was no longer aligned solely against her. She left the room with measured grace, aware that scandal had tightened its grip, and that the quiet war between restraint and devotion had only begun to reveal its true combatants, its first loyalties already drawn in ink meant for her alone. Night claimed Ravensmere with a deliberate hush, the sort that pressed against the windows and demanded confession from those wakeful within it. Eliza sat alone in her chamber, the candle guttering low as she folded her resignation letter with care that felt ceremonial. Each crease was precise, controlled, as though order on the page might quiet the disorder in her heart. She had written nothing accusatory, nothing pleading. Gratitude, regret, departure, words she had practiced long before she ever arrived. A knock sounded, measured yet uncertain. She stilled, listening, and when it came again she rose, smoothing her skirts as if dignity might be summoned by touch alone. The Duke stood beyond the threshold, not cloaked in authority but stripped of it, his coat unbuttoned, his expression restless. For a moment neither spoke. The corridor's lamplight wavered, outlining the strain in his features, the vigilance that had kept him intact and isolated. "I was told you intended to leave," he said at last, his voice low, almost careful. Eliza inclined her head. It seemed the most judicious course. He stepped inside without invitation, closing the door behind him as though sealing them into the moment. The air between them felt altered, heavier, charged with what restraint had long denied. He glanced at the folded paper on the desk, recognition flickering, then turned away, pacing once before stopping at the window. Rain traced slow paths down the glass, mirroring the deliberation with which he chose his words. "I have misjudged you," he said, "and in doing so, I have endangered what little peace remains in this house." Eliza did not rush to reassure him. Silence, she had learned, could be an act of respect. She waited, watching his reflection blur and reform in the darkened pane. "My wife," he continued, "died here. In this house. In that bed." He did not gesture, but the knowledge landed with precision. "She was laughter and fire, and when she left us, I sealed myself against such things. Not out of bitterness, but survival. I believed affection to be a liability I could not afford." His admission hung between them, fragile as glass. Eliza felt the instinct to soften it, to offer comfort, but she resisted. This was not a wound she could tend without consequence. "You bring warmth," he said, turning to face her at last. "Not ostentatiously, not recklessly, and that is what unsettles me most. My children see it. They respond to it. I see it too, though I have no right to. Eliza drew a careful breath. If my presence causes distress, I will remove it. I would not be the reason your grief is disturbed. That is precisely the trouble, he replied quietly. It has not been disturbed. It has been acknowledged. The word struck her with unexpected force. Acknowledged. As though grief were a living thing that required witness rather than burial. She met his gaze, finding not command there but vulnerability stripped of ceremony. I have been afraid, he said, the confession costing him visibly. Afraid that if I allow myself to feel again, I will fail them. That loving you, or anyone, would diminish what I lost. Eliza stepped closer, the distance narrowing not by design but necessity. Love does not divide, she said softly. It enlarges. But I cannot ask you to believe that. Nor will I remain where I am regarded as a threat rather than a choice. Something in her tone altered him. He watched her as though seeing her anew, not as an interloper or a solution, but as a woman standing firm in her own worth. The realization unsettled him more deeply than scandal ever had. You are right, he said, and that is why I must speak plainly now, before silence does further harm. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object, placing it upon the desk between them. It was a miniature portrait, the paint softened by age, depicting a woman whose eyes held mischief and tenderness in equal measure. This was my wife, he said. I have not shown it to anyone in years. I did not think myself capable. Eliza studied it with reverence, understanding the trust implicit in the gesture. She was loved, she said, not as observation but certainty. Yes, he answered. And loving her did not destroy me. Losing her did. The truth of it settled like a revelation. He straightened, as though having named the fear stripped it of some authority. I do not know what this means, he said, gesturing vaguely between them. I only know that driving you away would be an act of cowardice I can no longer justify. Eliza's heart quickened, hope and caution entwined. Then do not ask me to stay out of fear, she replied. Ask me because you wish me here. He hesitated, the pause weighted with consequence. In the silence, the house seemed to lean inward, listening. Somewhere below, a child laughed in sleep, the sound fleeting but undeniable. I wish you here, he said at last, the words measured irrevocable. Not as a solution, not as a scandal, but as yourself. The admission altered the air itself. Eliza felt the world tilt, not violently, but with the subtle certainty of a door opening. She reached for the resignation letter, unfolded it once more, then set it aside, unspoken agreement passing between them. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Tomorrow, he said, there will be questions. Scrutiny. Resistance. I am accustomed to such things, she replied. He nodded, then added, almost as an afterthought, there is something else. The children wrote to you. Her breath caught, the memory of the hidden paper flaring anew. Before she could ask more, he was gone, leaving behind confession, possibility, and the quiet certainty that whatever awaited her in Ravensmere, it would no longer be endured alone. Dawn entered Ravensmere with uncommon warmth, slipping past heavy curtains and settling upon the house as though invited. Eliza awoke with the echo of the Duke's words still resonant, their restraint more stirring than any declaration she had known. She dressed slowly, deliberately, as if haste might fracture the fragile equilibrium forged the night before. When she descended the stairs, the house felt altered, alert to a promise not yet spoken aloud. The children found her in the breakfast-room, their solemnity uncharacteristically subdued. Henry watched her with quiet purpose, while Clara hovered close, fingers twisting in her sleeve. They exchanged glances, a silent conspiracy unfolding between them, before Henry cleared his throat with exaggerated seriousness. We wished you to have something, he said, producing a folded paper smoothed nearly flat from handling. Eliza accepted it without opening, understanding instinctively that its power lay not in haste but in acknowledgement. Clara nodded with fierce approval, as though a decision had already been ratified beyond appeal. We thought you should know, she added simply. Eliza thanked them. her voice steady despite the sudden pressure behind her eyes, and the children departed, leaving behind a certainty more binding than any vow. Later, alone in her chamber, Eliza unfolded the letter. The handwriting wavered between discipline and enthusiasm, ink blotched where emotion had overtaken care. The message was brief, unguarded, devastating in its clarity. They had chosen her. Not out of rebellion, but recognition. The words settled into her bones, rewriting her understanding of belonging. The Duke awaited her in the garden that afternoon, the air alive with birdsong and the restless promise of spring. He stood beside the magnolia tree, its pale blossoms poised between bloom and surrender. When he turned at her approach, his expression bore neither command nor retreat, but something braver. He gestured toward the bench, an invitation rendered modest by intent. "I have been informed," he began, "that my children have acted without permission." Eliza met his gaze, unflinching. "They acted with conviction." He exhaled, the sound edged with reluctant admiration. "So they did." A pause followed, the silence neither strained nor empty. "Their letter was not the first I have received this morning. My sister writes from London. She has heard things." Eliza nodded, prepared. Scandal rarely announced itself without witnesses. "I expected as much." "She urges discretion," he continued. "Distance. Resolution." His mouth curved, not in humor but recognition. "She forgets that discretion has long governed this house, and see what it has wrought." Eliza said nothing. She sensed the direction of the moment, the careful alignment of courage and consequence. He turned toward the house, then back again, as though weighing two versions of himself. "I will not dismiss you," he said finally, "nor will I ask you to hide. If you remain, it will be with acknowledgment, and with my name attached to your presence." Her breath caught, not from triumph but gravity. "That choice will alter your standing," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "And so will the alternative." They walked then, side by side, through paths newly softened by sun. He spoke of his children's laughter returning in increments, of rooms long avoided now re-entered. Eliza listened, understanding that this confession was not meant to persuade but to include her in the accounting of his life. At the edge of the garden, he stopped. "I once believed love to be an act of recklessness," he said. "I see now it is an act of resolve." She regarded him steadily. "Resolve is only meaningful when sustained." "That," he answered, "is why I have not spoken lightly." He took her hand, not with urgency but intention, the contact reverent in its restraint. "If love is to be endured rather than declared, then I have loved you longer than I knew." The words did not ring with drama. They settled, enduring as stone. Eliza felt their truth not as exaltation but recognition, as though something long unspoken had finally found its shape. She did not answer at once. When she did, her voice held the calm of certainty. "Then let us endure honestly." A murmur of approval drifted from the terrace, where the children stood half-concealed, pride undisguised. The Duke followed her gaze, a smile breaking free despite his restraint. "They will never forgive me," he said lightly, "if I retreat now." "Nor should they," Eliza replied. The household adjusted not with ease, but intention. Invitations were declined. Rumors sharpened, then dulled. Eliza moved through the halls no longer invisible, yet not ostentatious, her presence sanctioned by quiet defiance. The Duke stood beside her at dinners, in corridors, beneath scrutiny that no longer unsettled him. One evening, as dusk pooled along the windows, he placed a small box upon her table. Inside lay a simple ring, unadorned, its elegance rooted in permanence rather than display. "I offer no spectacle," he said. "Only constancy." Eliza closed the lid gently. "Then let constancy be enough." As the fire settled and night drew near, the house breathed with new purpose. Yet beyond the walls, society waited, unpersuaded and patient. Eliza stood at the window, letter from the children pressed to her heart, aware that choice had been made but not yet tested. Somewhere beyond Ravensmere's gates, judgment gathered its strength, and love, newly acknowledged, prepared to meet it without disguise. Spring returned to Ravensmere not as spectacle but assurance, the slow greening of hedgerows and the measured warmth that coaxed life from soil long disciplined by frost. Eliza stood at the eastern window, watching the children cross the lawn with unrestrained laughter, their boots scattering petals, their joy no longer tentative. The house answered them now, doors opening easily, corridors carrying sound rather than swallowing it. The Duke joined her without ceremony. Time had softened neither his bearing nor his sense of consequence, yet something gentler had taken residence behind his eyes. Society had not forgiven him. Letters arrived edged with disapproval, invitations conspicuously absent, glances sharpened during the rare visits he did not decline. He accepted it all with the composure of a man who had already measured the cost and paid it willingly. They stood together as partners long before any vow made it official. Ravensmere adjusted to the truth of them with gradual certainty. Servants learned the cadence of shared authority. The children claimed Eliza openly, Henry presenting her as though the title were already hers, Clara slipping her hand into Eliza's with proprietary confidence. Love, once feared, had become the household's quiet law. The reckoning arrived without fanfare. A gathering at a neighboring estate forced the matter into daylight, drawing eyes hungry for confirmation. Eliza entered on the Duke's arm, her attire elegant in restraint, her posture unassailable. Whispers followed, then stalled. The Duke did not release her hand. When addressed, he introduced her by name and position, his voice steady, unyielding. In that moment, choice became irrevocable. Later, beneath a sky streaked with rose and ash, he led her away from the noise, to the carriage waiting beyond the lanterns. "I will not pretend the world will soften quickly," he said. "But it will learn." "I do not require its permission," she replied. He smiled then, unguarded, and reached into his coat. The ring returned to her palm, heavier now with intention fulfilled. "Nor do I," he said. "But I would have you choose freely, even now." Eliza met his gaze, seeing not rank but resolve, not refuge but devotion. "I have chosen," she said, and placed the ring upon her finger with deliberate grace. Ravensmere welcomed them home with light in every window. The children waited at the steps, solemn with anticipation. When they saw her hand, Clara clapped, Henry squared his shoulders in triumph, and the sound of their approval carried through the night like bells. The Duke drew Eliza close, his arm certain, protective without possession. Time moved forward, as it must. Seasons layered memory upon memory. Eliza's place became undeniable, not through spectacle but presence. She oversaw the household with fairness, guided the children with patience, and stood beside the Duke as his equal in all but name, until name itself became inevitable. On a quiet evening, as firelight steadied and the world narrowed to warmth and breath, the Duke retrieved a folded paper from a drawer. Its edges were worn soft. He placed it between them. "They chose you first," he said. "I followed." Eliza unfolded the letter, the childlike script unchanged, its truth undimmed. She felt tears rise, unashamed. "Then let us choose them always," she replied. He took her hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles with reverence earned, a gesture neither hurried nor ceremonial, but quietly binding. Outside, the house settled, content, timbers creaking as though acknowledging a promise kept at last. Somewhere within its walls, laughter echoed, not as intrusion but inheritance, the sound carrying through corridors once governed by silence. Love had entered Ravensmere not as conquest, but covenant, and in choosing one another, they had rewritten the terms of belonging with patient courage. The Duke led Eliza through the great hall, stopping before the ancestral portraits that had once judged her presence. He faced them now without apology. "This is my wife," he said, not loudly, but with a steadiness that brooked no revision. No one challenged the claim. Even the painted eyes seemed to soften, history bending to resolve. Eliza felt the weight of generations lift, replaced by the simpler gravity of being seen and named. In the days that followed, the world adjusted. Some doors remained closed. Others opened cautiously. Ravensmere endured regardless, strengthened by a center no longer hollow. Eliza learned the rhythms of her new title, not as ornament but obligation, and the Duke watched her assume it with admiration that required no audience. Together they shaped a household governed by warmth rather than fear, where love was neither spectacle nor secret. One evening, as twilight blurred the edges of the estate and lamps were lit in deliberate sequence, the children joined them by the hearth. Henry spoke first, his voice earnest. "You stayed," he said. Clara nodded in agreement, her certainty absolute. Eliza knelt to their height, embracing them both, understanding that this was the truest vow she would ever make. Later, when the house slept, Eliza returned the letter to its drawer, placing it beside the miniature portrait and the ring's empty box. The artifacts of choosing rested together, humble yet enduring. She closed the drawer gently, aware that memory, like love, required tending. At the window, the Duke drew her close. Beyond the gates, the road stretched onward, uncertain and unavoidable. She rested her head against his shoulder, unafraid. Whatever judgments awaited them, they would be met together, not in defiance, but devotion. Ravensmere stood behind them, alive with promise, and before them lay a future neither claimed by sorrow nor limited by fear, but shaped, day by day, by the quiet, irrevocable decision to love. They remained there until dawn hinted at the horizon, knowing that every tomorrow would demand courage, patience, and renewal, yet confident that what they had built could withstand scrutiny, sorrow, and time itself, because it had been chosen freely, defended openly, and rooted in a love neither hurried nor afraid, within the shelter of Ravensmere's steadfast walls forevermore bearing silent witness.